The 12th of April, 1943, Italy. On one of the gloomy days when an unnatural silence hung over the Italian coast, a group of women, armed only with determination and faith in freedom, became the targets of the ruthless war machine. In the villages and towns of central Italy, where the partisan movement actively fought against the Nazi occupiers, every woman who joined the resistance knew the risks to her life, but she also believed in her cause. These women, among whom were mothers, daughters, and sisters, continued to resist the fascists, sabotaging communication lines and destroying transport. However, the Nazis, intent on suppressing any opposition, began large-scale raids. One of these operations ended with the capture of a group of women partisans. Despite their physical vulnerability, these women did not surrender without a fight. Among them were experienced scouts and younger partisans who had just begun their baptism by fire. The capture took place in a small village they used as a base for preparing sabotage actions. With only old rifles and pistols in their hands, they put up a brave defense against the approaching soldiers. However, their determination could not save them. After a fierce firefight, the women were caught. They were grouped together and transported to the nearest fortress, where the main Nazi army headquarters was located. There, they awaited harsh interrogation, as the Nazis believed that every one of them held valuable information about the position of partisan groups in the region. Despite the brutal pressure, the women remained calm. Their gazes were cold, as if they had already prepared themselves for the ordeal. Internally, each one was ready to endure whatever came their way, knowing they had to stay steadfast in the face of torture and threats. As they entered the building, each step echoed through the ancient stone corridors. They knew their fate was now being decided in these walls. But the women did not lose hope. Among them was one who had been captured before but had managed to escape, and she knew that the Nazis would attempt to extract any information from them. Meanwhile, the German officers were preparing to begin the interrogation. Each woman was isolated to ensure the questioning would proceed one by one. But the Nazis did not expect what was to come. These women, despite their physical limitations, would prove more resilient than they had anticipated. The first step was clear: to make them talk. But their silence would be the beginning of something that would leave the enemy stunned. The 13th of April, 1943, Italy. The women captured by the German soldiers were now subjected to harsh conditions. Each of them was placed in separate cells under strict surveillance. Hours passed since their arrest, and now it was time for the interrogation to begin. German officers, intelligence agents, and soldiers were convinced that they would soon extract all the necessary information to suppress the partisan resistance. However, they were unaware of the strength of character they would face. All of them were women, but this did not mean they were weak or unprepared for the battle ahead. On the contrary, many of them had endured extreme hardships, fighting on the front lines in the most difficult conditions. Their willingness to resist did not falter, despite the physical and psychological pressure they were now under. As the hours passed, the German officers, having failed to get any response to their questions, began to resort to brutal methods of interrogation. Torture was a standard practice when dealing with partisans. Each officer tried to break the women's spirits, hoping that the threat of violence and death would compel them to speak, but their silence became their defense. The women did not crack under the pressure. They skillfully manipulated their tormentors, turning the interrogation against their captors. One of the first to stand firm against the torture was Maria Ferri, one of the most experienced partisans who had been captured before but managed to escape. She knew that the Germans would not expect such a response. When they threatened her with the usual methods, she met them with a cold stare and said nothing. The German officers tried to break her resolve, but she remained unshaken, understanding that silence was not only a defense, but a strategy, a way to weaken their enemies. At that moment, Maria was not just resisting. She was making her captors question their own methods. It was a psychological maneuver, one that caught the officers off guard. They thought they could force her into submission, but instead, her silent defiance became a weapon. Meanwhile, other women also stood firm. Instead of answering questions, they began to ask their own, steering the conversation away from the critical topics. They raised questions that confused their interrogators, causing them to hesitate. The Germans began to lose confidence in their own tactics. The more they tried to break the women, the more the women grew stronger in their resolve. It became clear to the captives that the interrogation could be used not just to extract information, but as a tool to undermine the enemy. They began to understand that the longer they held out, the more the Germans would doubt their ability to succeed. At that moment, the Nazi officers started to recognize that the women were not just holding out. They were turning the tables on them. The tables had turned, and the women had gained the upper hand in this psychological battle. The 14th of April, 1943, Italy. After 2 days of brutal interrogation and torture, the women continued to astound their captors. The Germans were now beginning to realize that their usual methods were ineffective. The officers, who had been so confident in their ability to break the women, were now unsure of how to proceed. They had tried everything: threats, violence, psychological manipulation, but the women held firm. The Nazis had believed that with enough pressure, these women would eventually give in. But instead of collapsing, the women became more inventive in their resistance. They did not just endure the pain, they were actively playing a psychological game, keeping their enemies off balance. The German officers, frustrated by the lack of progress, started to use more sophisticated tactics. They turned to the one thing they thought could destroy the women's resolve: fear for their loved ones. They threatened to kill or imprison the women's families, hoping to drive them to betray their comrades. But the women did not flinch. They stood their ground, even when shown pictures of their families, victims of the Nazi terror. When the photographs were presented to Laura Martini, one of the partisans, she was chained to a metal chair, her body marked by the marks of torture, her face bruised and bloodied. Despite this, she refused to give in. When the officer demanded that she confess to participating in the burning of Nazi supply depots, Laura replied without hesitation, "If I knew, I wouldn't be sitting here." This response shocked the officer. It was not just an answer, it was a challenge. He had expected her to crumble, to beg for mercy. But instead, Laura had used his own methods against him. She made him question his assumptions, his control over the situation. Her calm defiance rattled him more than any confession would have. Other women followed suit. Anna Rossini, another partisan, responded to an officer's demand for information about the location of a partisan base with the dry remark, "If I knew, I wouldn't be here." This was not a simple refusal. It was a calculated move that left the officer questioning his own tactics. As the interrogations continued, it became clear that the women were not simply holding out, they were turning the tables on their captors. Each time the Germans tried to break them, the women found a way to undermine their efforts. The Nazis had underestimated their prisoners, not realizing that these women were not just partisans, they were masters of psychological warfare. The longer the interrogation dragged on, the more it became apparent that the women were gaining the upper hand. The Germans, frustrated and demoralized, began to lose their confidence. They could no longer rely on the brutal methods they had always used to extract information. The women were not simply surviving. They were making the Germans doubt their ability to succeed. The 15th of April, 1943, Italy. After several days of futile attempts to break the women, The German officers began to realize that their traditional methods were not working. They had applied every technique they knew: violence, threats, manipulation, but nothing had shaken the women's resolve. Instead, each failed interrogation was strengthening their belief that these women were not just resisting, they were playing a game they had not anticipated. The Nazis' frustration grew, and the officers began to shift their focus. With physical torture no longer producing results, they tried a more insidious form of psychological manipulation. They showed the women images of their fellow partisans who had been killed in earlier raids, hoping to provoke guilt or fear. But once again, they were met with unexpected reactions. When the images of the dead partisans were brought to the women, their responses were calm, almost defiant. Instead of crumbling, their faces hardened. They did not break. Instead, they gave the Nazis the cold, silent response they had hoped to avoid. The officers were taken aback by the lack of fear, the absence of grief. These women were not mourning. They were focused, determined, and resolute. They knew that their comrades' deaths would not weaken their cause. If anything, they would fuel it. This response from the women left the German officers confused. The tactic that had worked on other prisoners, showing them the consequences of resistance, failed with these women. They weren't afraid to die. They had come to understand that their cause, their will to resist, could not be extinguished by death. The fear that the Nazis relied upon had no power over them. The women understood that this was a game of endurance. The longer they could hold out, the more the Nazis would begin to question their own methods. It was clear now that the Nazis had underestimated them. These women were not just waiting for death, they were using their imprisonment as a tool in the battle against the enemy. They had become a psychological weapon in and of themselves. As the days went on, the women began to realize that they were not just surviving, they were winning. They were taking control of the situation, turning the interrogation into a battle of wills. They had not given up any information, nor had they shown any sign of breaking. They had become masters of manipulation, using silence, defiance, and psychological warfare to outlast their captors. The German officers, unable to break them, began to doubt their own confidence. The interrogation had shifted from an attempt to extract information to a battle of endurance. The longer it lasted, the more the women's strength became evident, and the more the Nazis realized they were facing a much stronger opponent than they had ever anticipated. The 16th of April, 1943, Italy. After several days of relentless interrogation, the German officers found themselves cornered. The women continued to defy their captors, frustrating every attempt to break them. Despite the physical torture, despite the psychological pressure, the women did not yield. This resistance began to take a toll on the Nazi officers, who were slowly coming to the realization that these women were not simply resisting, they were manipulating the situation to their advantage. Frustrated and unable to obtain any information through traditional methods, the Nazis tried something new. They began to employ more psychological tactics. This time, they tried to break the women by threatening their families, hoping that the thought of their loved ones suffering would force them to cooperate. They were shown photographs of their parents, siblings, and children, all victims of the Nazi regime. The officers believed that these images, the visual reminder of the terror the Nazis had inflicted, would break the women's spirits. But once again, they were met with an unexpected response. When the photographs were presented, the women did not flinch. Their faces remained hard, their eyes cold. They did not show fear, nor did they break down in sorrow. Instead, they stood strong in their conviction. They knew that showing weakness would only empower their captors. In one particularly tense moment, the officer in charge ordered the interrogation of Laura Martini, one of the most resolute among them. She had been tortured relentlessly, her body bruised and beaten, but when shown the pictures of her family, she did not falter. She simply looked the officer in the eye and said, "What do you think these pictures will do? They can kill us, but they can never kill our will." This was the moment when the officers began to understand that physical threats, emotional manipulation, and the terror of death were ineffective. They had believed that the fear of losing their families would drive the women to confess, but it only solidified their determination. The women were no longer afraid of death. They had come to realize that their true strength lay not in the avoidance of death, but in their ability to endure it. The women's reaction shattered the officers' confidence. The Germans had tried to use the women's love for their families against them, but instead, they had fueled the women's resolve. The more the Nazis tried to threaten and manipulate, the more the women grew stronger. Each time their captors applied pressure, the women found new ways to fight back, using their silence, their unwavering courage, and their ability to turn the interrogation back on their tormentors. The officers, realizing they could not break the women, began to lose their composure. They had no more tricks up their sleeves, and the longer the interrogation continued, the clearer it became that they were not in control of the situation. The women were playing their own game, and they were winning. The 17th of April, 1943, Italy. The Nazi officers, having exhausted their usual methods of interrogation, began to lose faith in their ability to break the women. The tactics that had worked on other prisoners, physical torture, emotional manipulation, the threat of death, had no effect on these women. Every attempt to force them into submission was met with silence, defiance, and an impenetrable resolve. At this point, the officers began to realize they were not dealing with ordinary prisoners. These women had endured unimaginable pain and suffering, but still, they stood strong. The Nazis had used every method they knew to extract information, but nothing had worked. The women remained unmoved. In their frustration, the officers resorted to something they believed would break the women's solitude. They isolated each woman in separate cells, hoping the loneliness and separation would break their spirit. The women were no longer able to communicate with one another, but they did not waver. They had already learned to rely on their inner strength. However, this isolation did not have the effect the Nazis had hoped for. Instead of weakening the women, it only made them stronger. They began communicating through gestures, making silent promises to one another to hold out no matter the cost. They found ways to support each other, even without words. The officers, who had hoped to divide them, had instead unwittingly made the women's bond even stronger. The women used this time to regroup mentally. They knew that silence was their greatest weapon. The longer they held out, the more their captors would grow frustrated, and the more the Nazis would doubt their own ability to break them. This was no longer just about surviving. It was about defeating the enemy in the one arena they had left the psychological battle. The women began to realize that they were not just resisting, they were winning. They were taking control of the situation. Every day that passed, every hour that they endured without breaking, was another victory. They had not surrendered any information. They had not given their captors a single piece of intelligence. They were making the Nazis question their own methods, their own ability to extract information. The officers, noticing the growing frustration among their ranks, began to question whether they could achieve their goals. The isolation, the threats, the torture, nothing was working. The women had outlasted their interrogators. Their strength, their ability to withstand everything that had been thrown at them, was becoming undeniable. As the days passed, it became increasingly clear to the Germans that these women could not be broken. They had miscalculated, underestimating their strength. The women's determination and solidarity had become their greatest weapon. They had shifted the balance of power, and now it was the Germans who were losing control. The 18th of April, 1943. After days of futile attempts to break the women, the Nazi officers began to realize that their previous methods of torture and manipulation were ineffective. They had tried everything: physical violence, threats, psychological games, and isolation. But nothing had succeeded in forcing the women to betray their comrades or give up any valuable information. In fact, the longer the interrogations went on, the more it became clear to the Germans that these women were not just surviving, they were outlasting their captors. The officers, growing desperate, tried even more extreme tactics. They increased the pressure, resorting to psychological manipulation in an attempt to break the women's resolve. They offered them deals, freedom in exchange for information, leniency for confessions, but the women remained steadfast. They had no illusions about the Nazis' promises. They knew that any confession would lead to their deaths or the destruction of their comrades. Their mission was clear: resist at all costs and survive with dignity. But the most powerful weapon the women had was their ability to endure. They knew that the more they held out, the more they could weaken the Nazis' confidence. Their silence was a form of resistance, and the more the Germans tried to break them, the more they began to question their own methods. The women weren't just defying them. They were forcing the Nazis to face the limits of their own power. In one particularly significant moment, Laura Martini, one of the most defiant among them, faced the officer who had tortured her the most. She was again offered freedom in exchange for a confession. Without hesitation, she replied, "You can release me, but that won't stop the war. You can kill me, but you'll never destroy my belief." Her words were a reminder to the officer that he had no control over her spirit, no power over the cause she fought for. The Nazis realized that they could no longer use force to extract information. The psychological games had failed, and the threats were empty. They could no longer break the women's resolve, and every new attempt to pressure them only seemed to strengthen their determination. In the end, it was not just the physical endurance of the women that had won out. It was their ability to maintain their dignity and their unshakable belief in the resistance. The officers, seeing the futility of their efforts, began to acknowledge that they had underestimated their prisoners. The women had shown not only their resilience, but also their mastery of psychological warfare. The Germans could not break them; they had been outplayed. As the interrogation came to an end, the women were left with the certainty that their resistance had succeeded. They had stood their ground against one of the most powerful and ruthless forces in the world, and they had emerged victorious. Their victory was not one of physical combat, but one of spirit, willpower, and unity. The Germans, realizing their failure, began to lose confidence in their ability to control the situation. The 19th of April, 1943. After days of brutal interrogation and unyielding psychological pressure, the German officers finally admitted, albeit reluctantly, that they had failed. Despite their best efforts, they could not break the women. The women had endured relentless torture, had been isolated, and had been manipulated in every way possible, and yet they had not surrendered. Not a single piece of useful information had been extracted. In the end, the women had emerged not only unbroken, but victorious. The Nazi officers had come to the grim realization that their conventional methods, torture, threats, and psychological manipulation had failed against these women. The women, instead of being crushed by the horrors of captivity, had turned the tables. Every moment they endured, every time they withstood the pressure, they weakened the enemy's confidence and brought themselves closer to victory. For the women, the ultimate victory was not in obtaining a physical escape, but in proving that the Nazis could not defeat them. They had proven that the spirit of resistance could never be destroyed, no matter how brutal the circumstances. The Germans may have held the physical power, but the women had held on to their moral strength and determination. The officers began to realize that they could not intimidate or manipulate these women. Each of them, in her own way, had become a symbol of defiance. The interrogation process had become less about extracting information and more about realizing the extent of their failure. The Nazis had failed to break the spirit of these women, and that was something they could not undo. The moment the officers acknowledged their defeat was a turning point. The women had taken control of the situation, not by force, but through sheer endurance and willpower. They had used their greatest weapon, silence, defiance, and a deep belief in their cause to outlast their captors. By refusing to yield, they had shattered the illusion of Nazi invincibility. The officers, exhausted and demoralized, had no choice but to end the interrogation. Their efforts to extract information from the women had been in vain. The women had made it clear that no amount of torture or manipulation would ever break them. They had shown that the strength of will could overpower even the most powerful enemy. Their silence had been their weapon, and it had been stronger than anything the Nazis could throw at them. In the end, the victory was clear. The women had won, not through force, but through their ability to withstand, to endure, and to resist. Their refusal to break, their unshakable resolve, had turned the tide of the battle. And in that victory, they proved something far more powerful than a simple act of resistance. They proved that the human spirit, when united and unwavering, could never be conquered.